Good evening. This is the December 12, 2013 meeting of the Jefferson City Planning and Zoning Commission. My name is Ralph Robinette, and I will chair the meeting this evening. At this time, we will introduce our commissioners, council liaison, and staff. Councilman?
Rick Mihalovich, council liaison.
Mike Lester.
Chris Yarnell.
Jack Deacon.
Bob George.
Chris Jordan.
Dave Nunn.
Dean Dutoy.
Eric Barron.
The city code authorizes 9 regular members and 3 alternates. Alternates are designated to vote upon the absence or disqualification of regular members. Dale Vaughn is absent this evening, therefore, Bunny, you will be voting. A quorum consists of 5 members or alternates to conduct the business. I declare that a quorum is present. Are there any members who wish to disqualify them from anything that is on the agenda? I assume that the staff is ready with their agenda, so we're not going to reorder it. So we'll have the staff format of the hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The proceedings of the meeting are being recorded, so I ask that when you speak, please speak into the microphone. After a brief introduction by city staff, the opening presentation with an opening presentation, I'll try to keep it short. We will then ask to hear from supporters of the request, and then ask to hear from any opponents of the request, and then ask to hear from anyone else who wishes to speak on the request. City staff will then describe the proposal and make the recommendations on the request. In order to reduce the time necessary to hear the cases before you this evening, reference to printed material, including the staff reports, any applicable findings, ordinances, or statutes shall not be read into the record unless directed by the Commission. And the Commission will then close testimony from the floor, discuss the proposals, and then make a motion on the request. The form of the motion shall be positive, that is, the motion shall be made to accept the request as presented or with modifications, stipulations, or conditions, and a final vote would then be taken, ayes in favor, nays opposed, and the chairman shall announce the results of the vote, specifying the number of votes cast in favor and the number of votes cast against. The following documents are entered as exhibits for all items under consideration at this meeting: the city code as amended, the comprehensive plan and land use map, copies of the applications under consideration, the affidavit of publication of the public notice in the newspaper, copies of drawings, plans, and renderings under consideration, letters or memoranda from staff, the staff reports, the minutes of proceedings, letters, photos, memoranda, or other materials submitted by the public or the applicant, and the rules of procedure for the Jefferson City, Missouri Planning and Zoning Commission. And all of these items are public record and are available for inspection in the Department of Planning and Protective Services or through the Office of the City Clerk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have no request for any continuance, therefore the chair will entertain a motion at this time to approve the tentative agenda. Have a motion second. All indicate in favor by saying aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carried. You also have in your packet the November minutes, if you want just a minute or two to look at those, and then we will approve those or correct them as needed.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as submitted.
All in favor indicate by saying aye. Opposed, nay. The minutes are approved. We have no communication. I'm not aware of any unfinished business. New business. Case P13017, zoning text amendment. Staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the first of 2 staff-initiated proposals before you this evening. This first one consists of, I believe it's 22 separate amendments to the zoning code. It was discussed at the last meeting. I've done a little bit of extra research on basically the one item that had a few questions on, but we have posted it for public notice, and this is the official public hearing for the 22 separate amendments to the zoning code that are all worked together into one council bill. You'll notice that in your packets I've got about 3 different documents there. The first is a 1-page listing of the 22 different amendments. Then the second, third, and fourth pages is each of those 22 amendments with just a brief amount of justification listing why we're proposing it. And then behind that is the actual council bill that, if approved, would move on to the City Council for final approval. I'd like to touch on each one of these items fairly briefly because all of them are fairly minor. They're fairly minor adjustments to the zoning code to address fairly specific items. And I'll just jump right into it. I've divided them into several different categories. The first has to do with the land use matrix within the zoning code and specific use standards within the zoning code. Basically where different things can be located and any conditions that might be on them within the zoning code. First, item number 1, changing daycare homes from a conditional to a permitted use in the residential districts. Right now, daycare homes, and a daycare home is for a daycare of between 7 and 10 children. Right now, they are a conditional use in all residential zoning districts. People wanting to establish a daycare home at their house have to go in front of the Board of Adjustment and get a conditional use permit. If someone wants to establish one for 6 children or less, they do not have to go through the board. If they want to establish one for more than 10 children, 11 or more, that is not permitted. They would have to seek out a commercial location. This proposal is to change that daycare home from being a conditional to a permitted use in those residential districts so that they would not have to go to the Board of Adjustment to seek approval. It would also eliminate the 200-foot separation requirement with that, within that specific use requirement for daycare homes, which very rarely comes up and could potentially prohibit someone from having a daycare home just because they happen to be within 200 feet of someone who already has a permit for one. In the past 10 years, 7 daycare home applications have been heard by the Board of Adjustment. All of them were approved by the board with little or no concerns expressed at the public hearing. Item number 2, changing schools from a conditional to a permitted use within the C1 and C2 districts. I think what I meant to say there is private schools, changing private schools from a conditional to a permitted use in the C1 and C2 districts. Right now they're kind of, they don't match up well with other uses that are permitted within the C1 and C2 districts, like business schools. This would just change that so private schools are held at the same standard as a business school. Number 3, changing bars from a conditional to a permitted use in the C3 downtown commercial zoning district. There are a number of bars downtown. That's fairly common knowledge. Let's see. In my research, in the past 20 years, there have been 5 conditional use permits approved for bars on High Street, and none denied. The permits that were approved had no noteworthy conditions attached to the approvals. Seems to be a burden sending them in front of the Board of Adjustment to conduct a fairly routine business that's already in the downtown area. So this amendment would change that so that they no longer have to go in front of the board. Number 4, differentiating indoor and outdoor mini storage uses. Our zoning code and zoning codes across the country really have some pretty strict standards regarding outdoor mini storage uses. Have a number of different buffer yard requirements within our zoning code and other things. But it's becoming increasingly more common that businesses are wanting to start up indoor mini storage uses, climate controlled, for example, and our zoning code does not differentiate between the two. So this amendment would separate them out so that they're not held to the same standard, and outdoor storage uses would still be held to a fairly strict standard with a few amendments that are listed here, basically modifying the buffer yard screening and fencing requirements slightly based on some of our past experience of dealing with site plans for them. But the indoor storage units would basically match up fairly well with normal commercial uses in commercial districts. Number 5, permitting residential uses in basements of non-residential buildings. Several years ago, and this was actually before I got here, there was an amendment to the zoning code to essentially allow for loft apartments. Residential uses with the 2002 zoning code rewrite were basically prohibited within the commercial districts. But then an amendment came through to allow them as loft apartments. And I think the intent at the time was to also allow them within basement areas, anything essentially except on the main floor. But that's not how it made it into the zoning code. This amendment would formalize that by making sure that people could have basement level residential uses. More than likely, the place we would see this would be in the downtown district. There's several buildings there with basement areas that would be fairly suitable for conversion to residential uses. But it would allow it throughout the city as a whole in all of the commercial zoning districts, as long as it's not on the main level. Number 6, permitting apartment buildings with 8 or more units in the C2 district. We have had questions from time to time regarding, wanting to put apartments within the C2 zoning district. There's an awful lot of C2 zoning within Jefferson City. This would allow for a little bit more flexibility with those types of developments by allowing larger apartment buildings within that general commercial zoning district, but not opening it up to smaller scale residential uses. That is the first set. Are there any questions on any of those items? I'd be happy to answer.
Any questions at this time? Yes, Chris.
Eric, regarding the number of units for apartment building in C2, where did the number 8 come from?
8 is a fairly common number for an apartment building, 4 up and 4 down. Really, that's where it came from. It makes more sense than 9 and less sense than 7, or I'm sorry, less sense than 9 and more than 7. But it was chosen specifically to exclude the smaller 4-plex and 3-plex style of buildings.
I just didn't know if 6 was a number that would be more reasonable with the type of lots and zoning that we have. Not that it really makes me any difference. I just didn't know if that was kind of just a standard you saw between other communities or whatever.
That is worth discussing. 8 is a fairly large number. There, I could see potentially of buildings. A lot of times it's existing buildings that people are having hard finding commercial tenants for, and want to transform into a residential use. 8 might be a stretch in some cases to fit within a building, but then again, I don't know that I would want to go too low because certainly mixing the smaller scale residential into commercial districts creates some conflict.
Yeah, and I concur with that. I mean, only 4 would probably be way too low, but I don't know, for some reason 6 kind of hit me as that kind of that jump, I guess you'd say, of out of the small stuff and into kind of the more larger scale. But
Are there any other thoughts on that specific item?
Any other questions on that section? Yes, Chris.
I have one on 3, and I should have done my research on this, and I didn't. I apologize. And I may be all wet. Was there something with having the bars in that downtown section that had to do with proximity to a church?
That is a separate section of the code,
Okay.
And it deals with the liquor license.
Okay.
And I don't recall the numbers off the top of my head, but there are separation requirements from churches, schools, and parks.
And this would not affect that?
No, it's completely separate
Okay.
from that.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on that section? Dave?
Some buildings that are probably just inside the C3 area that are one store after I read many of them, but some where
And that is one note that I skipped over here. At the last meeting, there was some discussion about expanding the ability to have residential uses in the downtown district. Really, we intend to do some more research on that, because there's also the desire not to necessarily allow residential uses where storefront commercial is really more ideal. To do that really subtracts from the remaining storefront commercial within that area. So it would probably have to be a very finely worded type of amendment to the zoning code to allow to open up more opportunity for residential uses in the downtown area without detracting from its commercial nature. This amendment's not necessarily meant to do that. It's meant to solve a fairly specific issue regarding allowing them on the basement level. But we do intend to do some more research on that and hope to come back at a later date with the potential amendment, depending on where that research goes.
Any other questions on this section? Want to go to 2?
Yes, density and dimensional standards amendments. Most, if not all of these amendments, deal with the one chart within the zoning code that deals with minimum lot size, maximum units per acre, setbacks, things like that. Number 7, removing the units per acre maximum density for single-family and duplex residential districts. Right now, the density for these districts are listed twice, one for units per acre and one for minimum lot size, which creates a conflict because the two don't match up. So we're proposing to eliminate the units per acre and just rely on the maximum lot size to establish the density. Number 8, raising the maximum lot coverage from 50% to 65% in the RS3, RS4, RD, and RA1 districts. These are the more dense residential districts. We typically see smaller lot sizes within these districts, and property owners can be hard pressed to fit all the different things they want on their property on some of these smaller lots and still meet the maximum lot coverage for the district. The maximum lot coverage is calculated basically all of the impervious surface on the lot. So if rainfall falls on it and it runs off, it's basically included in that maximum lot coverage. We believe a slight bump from 50 to 65% in that lot coverage for those districts will allow more flexibility for those property owners within those dense districts without really causing any major concerns or problems. Number 9, raising the maximum floor area ratio in the C2, M1, and M2 districts. Right now, the floor area ratios in those districts are, quite frankly, a little bit low. For example, in the C2 district, it essentially wouldn't allow for a 2-story building if it were on a very small lot. And sometimes that does occur. Usually, you don't see a lot of issues with the floor area ratio because a parking lot affects the floor area ratio on a property so much. But sometimes there are single buildings on a lot with off-site parking that the floor area ratio could conflict with. We believe by amending the C2 district from 1 to 2 and the M1 and M2 districts from 0.5 to 1 would solve a lot of those problems, again, without creating any major land use concerns. Number 10, lowering the minimum lot area for the RU district from 80 acres. And I originally had that to 3 acres, and I've actually am proposing to change that to 2 acres, and let me describe why. But first, the current 80-acre minimum lot area is just unworkable. To have a minimum lot area of 80 acres is basically impossible. I did a fair amount of research on this. This was one of the items that we discussed last week or last month. There was a couple examples put out. For example, Cole County has a 5-acre basically exemption within their subdivision code that if a piece of property of 5 acres or more is being being created. You don't have to go through a subdivision plat. That's really where that comes from. I don't think it really has the same purpose as what our RU zoning district has. I looked at a number of similar districts. You know, every town names their zoning district something different, but basically districts similar to our RU district in a number of different comparable cities across Missouri, and have some of the acreages listed there. For example, Columbia in their similar district has a minimum lot area of 2.5 acres. The city of Chesterfield has it of 3 acres. And the city of O'Fallon has it at 2 acres. And the city of Lee Summit has it at 1 acre. Also did a little bit of history into some of the zoning cases that have come before this body proposing to rezone single pieces of property that are kind of in agricultural areas, from RU to single family for the sole purpose of creating a single buildable lot, and the acreages associated with those requests. And those sizes were 2 acre, 2.01, 2.54, and 2.55. So really there's a lot of things pointing toward a minimum acreage of basically 2 acres, possibly 2.5. But using the previous examples that have come before this body, I'd recommend a 2 acre minimum lot area. I believe that would be large enough that it still preserves the intent of the RU zoning district, yet small enough to still be a usable tool for people wanting to create that one additional lot. And that is the end of that section. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions on that section?
I have 2. And I don't know what the number was. And they're both theoretical. Well, one of them's theoretical for you, Eric. On number 8, and I know we're not there. We're not dealing with stormwater utilities or anything like that, but do you see allowing that much more coverage to be an issue for your stormwater as we move forward, as the city moves forward with stormwater?
It is somewhat uncommon for people to bump up against that maximum. It does occur, and we regularly have to tell people that they cannot put in an additional storage shed or a driveway or something. But it's fairly uncommon, and where it is, it's usually in the already developed areas of the city.
I don't have an issue with where we go. I'm looking down the road.
Yeah, I don't think that it would be a major issue with the stormwater, simply because it's not that much of an increase. So, yeah, I mean, if
you
that.
know what I'm saying? But you say it's not that much of an increase, but it's from 50 to 65 is 30%. Right?
Well, yes.
Okay.
Well, it's really 15%. I'd still maintain that it's 15%, but
okay.
Yeah.
I'm asking the question. Shane's not here.
Yeah.
But just from a stormwater perspective, and I kind of know. I mean,
I think the larger
I understand
issue
where EPA
is
headed and what the city's going to eventually be.
Yeah, I mean the larger issue is, of course, is that it's previously undeveloped land that was 0%.
Right.
And then we built, someone built a house on it and put in a driveway and brought it up to 50%. That's the major impact.
That's the huge impact. From 50 to 65 is not that big an impact, but
yeah.
In certain areas it may be.
I did do some research on that one as well, and it turns out that different cities regulate that in slightly different manners, but we are on the low side. We're fairly restrictive.
It's just something that came across, and Shane wasn't here, and I thought, I got a question about that one. The last one, the next question I've got is somewhat of a practical issue, and I don't know the answer to this, but are most of the times when you have somebody wanting to cut off a piece off of 80 acres, and you had 3 examples, are they looking at an on-site sewer, or are they connecting to the city sewer?
That is something that I looked into as well, and it can be mixed. If there is city sewer available, obviously they would connect.
They have to connect.
Yes.
I understand that, but I'm
if there's not, then they fall under different guidelines for what they can do in terms of a sewer, an on-site system. Now, it used to be that on-site systems had to have a certain acreage
Right.
on their property, but they don't anymore.
I understand.
Those rules were changed so that they have to have essentially a soil percolation test. And if they
Understand.
pass that test, they can have a system. Now, sometimes they need an awful lot of land to pass that
And
test.
that's where I'm headed, is 2 acres
Well-
frequently can be a stretch.
The zoning, the amount of land they need for that system would not negate or be in conflict with what's required for zoning. If they needed 3 or 4 or 5 acres in order to pass that test, then that's the size of lot they'll need if they want an on-site system. And so, if
But
they
most people don't think about that till after they've done all that.
well,
I understand that.
we're fairly good at establishing those sewer requirements when they come forward. So, when they come forward for that parcel division or subdivision, whatever the case may be, that is one of the items that we ask. And so they're
there's a lot of how close they can be to the property line and how close they can be to their water source, whether it's public or private. And, I mean, there's a lot of rules that go with that
Yes.
on-site sewer.
yes.
Okay.
Any other questions? We go to the next one, Eric?
The next is the definition section. It's fairly short. Defining retail packaged liquor stores. We don't have a definition, and we need one. This would do that. Number 12, firming up a definition for a rear lot line for irregularly shaped lots. Right now, our definition is missing a few words. What we're proposing essentially is it's fairly common how zoning codes define a rear lot and irregularly shaped lots. We're following that common definition through this amendment. Number 13, defining indoor and outdoor mini storage. As I mentioned earlier, just separating those two. So we'd amend the definition for them as well. I'll move on to the parking amendments. Unless there are any questions on
Any
that particular.
questions?
All right. Parking amendments, number 14, correcting a typo for a medical office parking. There's a typo that says 2 per 200. It should say 1 per 200 square feet. That's a fairly standard parking requirement for that use. Number 15, changing the requirement for general retail shopping centers from 1 per 200 square feet to 1 per 250 square feet. Looked at various other zoning codes plus experience with general retail uses within our own city. Basically, we have a slightly high level of parking requirement. This would ease that by a little bit and should not create any major problems. Number 16, changing the requirement for low-volume retail, such as furniture stores, from 1 per 400 square feet to 1 per 500 square feet. Again, we looked at other zoning codes and kind of standards across the country and found that we're a little bit high. This would allow them to exist with slightly lower level of parking than they would today. So any questions on parking?
Questions?
The next is buffer yard amendments, changing the requirement for fences in the Type B buffer yard. The Type B buffer yard is the middle one between our 3 different buffer yard requirements, A, B, and C. It's usually used to screen, use an example, kind of office or light commercial type uses from heavier, residential or multifamily residential uses. It's a fairly low level or medium level of screening and involves a row of trees and a 3-foot tall fence. The 3-foot tall fence is the problem. Oftentimes, the 3-foot tall fence does not really provide much screening, and quite frankly, I'm not sure why it would need it. The only reason I can think a 3-foot tall fence would be helpful is if there's a parking lot associated with the development and you're wanting to keep the headlights off of the neighbor. This amendment would change that so that the 3-foot tall fence is only required basically to shield headlights, so when it's adjacent to a parking lot. and otherwise would not be required. Number 18, requiring a fence in the Type C buffer when conifer trees are used for the buffer. Of the different options within the Type C buffer yard, one of them is conifer trees. For some reason, a fence is not required when conifer trees are used as a Type C buffer yard. It's kind of been my experience that conifer trees often die or oftentimes take a long time to mature, and even then do not provide the same type of screening that a fence would. So this amendment would require a fence even in that instance, a 6-foot tall fence, similar as to the other different options within the Type C buffer yard. Number 19, removing the buffer yard fence requirement when topography results in no benefit from the fence. It's fairly common in Jefferson City, given our terrain, that a property being developed may sit much higher or much lower than its neighbor, and a buffer yard fence simply has no effect. In those instances, rather than requiring the property owner to go before the Board of Adjustment or put the fence up, to simply negate that requirement. Number 20, eliminating the dual buffer yard requirement by only requiring buffer yards on the more intensive side of a zoning district boundary. Right now, we require buffer yards on both sides of a zoning district boundary, even the less intensive side. This would eliminate that. It's fairly standard in zoning codes that it's the more intensive side that needs the buffer yard. I'd be happy to answer any questions about buffer yard requirements.
I have a question on number 19. Who decides that the topography is such that a fence is not?
The director. It'd be an administrative decision by the director.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I guess I would follow up on that. What if the developer didn't like the director's recommendation? Would that then become an issue for the commission?
Then they would go in front of the Board of Adjustment,
Board of Adjustment.
either as a variance from that requirement or an appeal to the director's determination. More than likely, they'd just apply for the variance at that point. But I don't think the intent is to negate a fence when one would provide screening. If in doubt, I think the director would choose to require the fence and let the developer go before the Board of Adjustment if they disagreed. So.
Any other questions?
The next one is recycling collection stations. Basically to allow them as an accessory use to non-residential uses with various conditions, basically to make sure they're kept clean. There's a conflict within the zoning code on recycling collection stations, essentially that they're permitted outright in certain zoning districts when they're on their own piece of property as a primary use, but when they're associated or when they're an accessory use, such as being located out in front of a grocery store or something to that effect, technically they need a conditional use permit. Well, there's a number of them around town, but this would essentially clean that up so that there's no longer a conflict, and that accessory use then becomes permitted outright in the commercial zoning in industrial zoning districts without requiring any type of Board of Adjustment action. And then I'll go on to the last one, the attached single-family residential, which is number 22, reducing the minimum lot size and lot width for attached single-family units. Our zoning code is kind of weak in that it does not allow for real flexibility whenever someone wants to build a duplex on top of a lot line with each unit located on its own property. It can be done, but it's the lot requirements and widths and setbacks can come into conflict with that. This would clear that up so that it can be done and can be done by developers in the future. So. The minimum lot width of 30 feet and 3,000 square feet that's referenced within that is half of the normal lot requirement for an RD lot. So a person could build a duplex on an RD lot, which is 60 feet wide and 6,000 square feet minimum, or they could build we call it a townhome, 2 separate units that are attached on that lot and divide it in half so that each lot is 30 feet wide and 3,000 square feet. So the density would not change, but it would allow them to put a lot line up the middle of the structure, basically. I'd be happy to answer any questions on those two or any of the other ones.
Any questions? Is there anyone here that wishes to speak in favor of these zoning text amendments? Is there anyone here that would like to speak in opposition to these zoning text amendments? Seeing none, we'll close the public testimony. Staff report.
I think I've given a pretty lengthy description. I'd be happy to answer any questions. The staff recommendation is for approval, including the amendment of the originally proposed 3-acre minimum requirement for the RU district down to 2 acres. With that one change in what's being proposed, I'd request approval by the Planning and Zoning Commission so we can send it on to the City Council.
Any questions of staff? Yes, Chris.
Eric, is there any thoughts on that number for the apartment buildings, or you want to stay with 8?
I think we would prefer to stay at 8. We've given it a lot of thought. It is it is a pretty significant change in terms of what's allowed in the C2 district. It might be worth revisiting at a future date, but for now I'd like to stay at 8 units.
Let's say we stay with your recommendations and research them.
Any other discussion, questions? Okay. You want to just adopt the zoning text amendments and then we'll outline them in our report here, or do you want to read each one again? Let's just adopt the zoning text amendments.
Yes,
Is that fair enough with you?
in whole with the one staff change to the RU district.
Good enough for you, Counselor? Yes, sir. Okay. Any other discussion? Chair would entertain a motion to adopt these zoning text amendments.
So moved. I would move that we adopt the zoning text amendments as outlined by the staff report with the changes that were reflected therein.
Second.
Discussion. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Passes unanimously.
Thank you.
Next case, P13018, zoning text amendments, telecommunication facilities. Staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the new cell tower bill. Essentially, I've been working on it for quite a while. I've presented it to you several times. I'll go over it as brief as I can. That's hard to do because it is an awful long chapter or section of the code. Our existing cell tower code is in basically in need of being revised, rewritten. Has a number of errors in it and some, quite frankly, outdated information. This would change that. The major change, well, it does move the entire cell tower section to a separate section of the zoning code so that it's not existing mixed in with all the other specific use standards. So it'll be a little bit easier to reference when speaking to cell tower companies. The major change is right now the maximum height of a cell tower is calculated based on the zoning district. We literally take whatever height that is allowed within that zoning district, add 20 feet, I think, and that is the height of a cell tower that is allowed by right within the city. To give the ridiculous example is if someone wanted to put a cell tower up in the C3 downtown commercial zoning district, which has a maximum height of 140 feet for any building, they could put up a 140-foot cell tower without any type of public comment. There's other things that would probably keep them from doing that, such as various setback and separation requirements, but that's the one example worth pointing out. This change would make it so that cell towers at a height of 70 feet or more would require a conditional use permit from the Board of Adjustment and would therefore go through a public hearing. Cell towers with a height of 70 feet or less than 70 feet would not require a conditional use permit. They'd be permitted outright, but again, there's still a number of separation and buffer yard, separation and setback requirements for towers. In the event of a piece of property being zoned PUD, the tower would still be presented as a PUD plan and would come before this body and then on to the City Council for final approval. To touch on a few of the things here, changes to existing towers, and usually these are antenna switch outs or adding additional antennas to an existing tower would be permitted outright as they are now, so that cell tower companies can continue to use existing towers as long as there's space on them to locate there. All towers would have to be of a monopole design. The equipment shelters that are located beneath the tower would have to have an exterior finish that's suitable, basically compatible with the area. And then also would have to be screened by a 6-foot tall fence around the compound site. There's a little bit more technical language within the actual bill that addresses how that would be done. The section would also deal with antenna arrays that are located on top of buildings. Basically, they could, an antenna array can be located on top of a building as long as it doesn't extend more than 20 feet above the building. There's a little bit of language regarding sometimes towers located in sensitive areas. There's a desire to have them camouflaged or disguised. Sure. I hope all of you have seen the pictures of palm tree cell towers and things like that. Around Jefferson City, we have a number of flagpole cell towers, but there's a little bit of language in there that would allow the Board of Adjustment to require a disguised tower in some of those in areas where they really need to be screened. Really, what I'm getting at is if it happens to be in a residential area or something. But that it would be a decision by the board. And then also there's a pretty significant upfront fee that would be used for any reimbursement of consultant fees if the city chose to have essentially a second opinion on any aspect of a tower application. That's pretty standard when looking at other codes of other cities, that if the city wants a second opinion from a cell tower consultant, they could go out and hire someone to determine, is the need actually there for a cell tower? Can existing towers be used? If not, why not? And things like that. So there's some money put in place to allow for that. That's a fairly brief description of it. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have on it.
Any questions of staff?
Mr. Chairman, those, if I understood it right, I believe we discussed this last month, weren't those, the existing towers are grandfathered in, is that correct?
Yes.
And then what if they have any new construction, do they have to comply with this then if they don't comply now, being they're grandfathered in?
If they have new construction, then they would fall under this requirement. Now, usually how to put it? If for any reason the tower height is modified or something to that effect, then they'd have to comply with the new code. If they're just adding an antenna array onto an existing tower, then it's that's permitted outright. At most, we'd require them to basically bring the compound site up to the screening requirement by putting a fence around it. And making sure that the building that they put up is somewhat compatible with what's around it.
Any other questions of staff at this time? Michael?
You have the 1.5 mile radius for requiring a survey. How is that standard? How is that decided?
And that's when a tower application is made, we want to ensure that they have looked at every other tower in the area to confirm that none of the existing towers will work.
But why not 2 miles or 3 miles?
The 1.5 that was taken from other codes, so I would say it's fairly standard.
Okay, and in the maintenance, you don't say anything about maintenance of the grounds around the tower. Is that something that's?
If anything, that might fall into some of the other chapters of the city code, so it's really not needed to be addressed within this chapter.
One more question. What does the city require as far as insurance from possible damage if the tower collapses or whatever? Does the city require anything in regard to insurance to protect the property owners?
I would defer to Jeremy, but I'm pretty sure that the answer is no. Just like any other piece of property in the city, if a building were to collapse or anything, it's really incumbent on the property owner to have their own insurance, and they'd be liable if for some reason a tower did collapse and fall on a neighboring building. They're liable for that. Is that incorrect?
That would be correct.
Yes. And Mr. Lester, I could be mistaken. I think that there is some verbiage somewhere within the the many pages there regarding that the property needs to be maintained, but it also would fall under the general property maintenance sections of the city code. If for some reason it were not being maintained, we would handle it.
Okay, thank you.
So.
I have a question, sir. Under your key concepts for E, you talk about land owned by the city. Are they not allowed on land owned by the city now?
They are allowed on land owned by the city. In fact, if there is land available by, that's owned by a unit of government, be it federal, state, local, towers are kind of seen as a utility and are required to locate on those types of properties.
Okay, it caught me odd. I don't know.
Any other questions at this time? Is there anyone here who would like to speak in favor of the zoning text amendment regarding telecommunications facilities? Is there anyone here who would like to speak in opposition to this proposal? Seeing none, we'll close the public testimony. Staff report.
I'd be happy to answer any questions. Other than that, ask for approval of the proposed amendment so that we can move it forward to the City Council.
Further questions of staff? Discussion. Chair would entertain a motion then.
Before I make a motion, I'd like to commend Eric on all the work he's done, because I know this took a lot of research for both of these. So thanks for doing all that.
And I may not have mentioned this up front, but I did do this by reading an awful lot of other cell tower codes, which is not the most exciting thing in the world. But it is crafted off of other codes. I essentially, to kind of sum it up, I took the best pieces of other codes and merged them into what we already had in order to fix our code, and that's what I'm bringing before to you.
I can tell you did that with the other amendment, plus evidently going through a lot of city files, so I know that took a lot of time. I would move that we approve the amendment as presented.
Second.
Discussion. All in favor indicate it by saying aye for the motion. Opposed, nay. Motion is approved. Other business. Michael, you have a report for us today?
Short report. The Environmental Quality Commission met this week. We've been having trouble meeting. We haven't met in a while because of trouble getting a quorum together. This meeting was at noon to 1, a lunch meeting, and we may do that more often. That worked out well. I'll report that there's been some updates on the recycling portion of the website that now it includes where you can recycle prescription medications. We're continuing to work on the Make Your Mark campaign to better brand Jefferson City as an environmental friendly city. The chairperson of the council is going to speak before the city council, probably not this next meeting, but within the next couple of meetings, about the goals and accomplishments of the commission. And that's my report.
Thank you for serving on it. I know that's an additional meeting for you, so thank you, Mike. Any other business? Okay, thank you for coming. Have a blessed Christmas, prosperous New Year. We're adjourned. See you next year.
Mr. Chairman? Yes. Have a good Christmas. Very good.